Thank you very much for coming today. It is my pleasure and my honor to introduce Dr. Fiery Cushman on the topic of moral learning and the law. What's the brain got to do with it? Dr. Cushman is a PhD in psychology. He did his doctorate degree here at Harvard as well as his undergraduate degree, and did a postdoc working with Dr. Joshua Green, who is one of the pioneers of experimental moral philosophy. Dr. Cushman brings together experimental methods from psychology, an interest and deep knowledge of neuroscience, and takes both and applies them to moral questions. Now, law and morality are not the same, but they are deeply interrelated with each other. All of the terms that we have in law that serve as blank signifiers for us to fill in, like the reasonable person, or negligent conduct, or recklessness, a risk that you should not have been indifferent to. These all import moral and normative content. When a jury determines whether a person was acting as a reasonable person, either in the criminal or in the civil context in tort law, that is, according to all of our treatises, explicitly by reference to the standards of the community in which the decision is being made. Some argue that moral absolutes are universal and therefore the relevant decision-making community doesn't matter. There are some moral principles that appear conserved across most cultures, most notably the precept that it is wrong to kill, although all cultures add their own qualifications to that about who it's really okay to kill and who not. However, it's hard to dispute the argument that much of our more fine-grained moral intuitions are local and historically contingent, that they vary from place to place and from time to time. For that reason, in tort law and in criminal law, if a person's conduct would have been reasonable in his or her country or community of origin, but is not reasonable in the community in which the legal matter is being decided, that person has no excuse. He or she is still held to the moral standards of the community in which the decision is being made. Furthermore, as law students or lawyers, or even as ordinary non-legal citizens, you're probably familiar with the maxim, ignorance of the law is no excuse, yes? The reason that we can say ignorance of the law is no excuse and not just have it be a technical gotcha for people who haven't read all the law books is because our laws are supposed to comport with morality and social norms within our relevant community closely enough that if you are behaving as a good community member and a moral person, you generally won't be violating the law anyway. And therefore, we think any appropriate moral person should not need to have the excuse, oh, I didn't know that theft was against the law. I didn't know that killing was against the law or hitting someone, because those are not only against the law, they are what we think of as core moral prohibitions. Fiery's work, Dr. Cushman's work, looks at how moral intuitions are learned and transmitted. How is it that as a society we develop and communicate moral norms amongst each other and to the next generation? And it also raises very interesting questions about moral learning across communities, particularly in a nation like ours that is comprised of people who almost exclusively have come from elsewhere. And so either we or our parents or our grandparents had to learn new morals and new norms as they came to the United States. How does that happen? We will hear Dr. Cushman's talk, and then we'll have some time that I'm very much looking forward to for question and answer at the end of this session. Thanks very much, Dr. Cushman.
Great, thanks very much. I'm super excited to be here. I'm particularly excited because the work that I'm going to talk about, both my own work and in large part other people's work, is some of the stuff that I'm just most excited about in general right now. It's really energizing content for me. And my interest in these topics began maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I read a book which is at once a flawed book, in fact, maybe deeply flawed book. It's got some essential problems, I think, in some of the reasoning and some of the data, and yet undeniably an incredibly provocative book. And I know you all think you know which book I have in mind, but this is not it. It's actually a book called On Killing. So this is a book that was written by a lieutenant colonel in the US military, David Grossman, who is grappling with a problem that the military has, which is that a remarkable proportion of soldiers on the front lines of battle will not shoot to kill. Now, for any of us not in the military, this is actually a really uplifting fact about humanity, but obviously for the military, it's a big problem. And in this book, he attempts to sort of collate a large body of evidence showing that in war after war and situation after situation, this is what happens. Now, before I even discuss any of the evidence, want to say some of this has been controversial. And I think part of the controversy stems from the fact that war is an incredibly difficult thing to study and quantify. But part of what I'm going to try to do in this talk is use this as a springboard to take a more disciplined and rigorous approach to this phenomenon. And here's an example of the kind of data that Grossman was interested in. So in the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the most bloody conflicts in US history, at the end of the battle, there were 27,500 muskets and rifles that were collected from the battlefield. These were presumably mostly left by people who had been killed or people who had run away. Now ask yourself, should the muskets have been loaded or empty? The way that you might go about trying to answer that question is to say, if you were a soldier engaged in combat, what proportion of the time should your musket have been spending full versus empty? And the answer is obviously it should spend almost all of its time empty because you have a whole wall of people in front of you trying to kill you. They're not that far away. The moment you've got your weapon loaded, you should aim it and shoot into that wall of people. Now it's empty, and then it takes you some time to reload it again. When you look at data on soldier training, where they're trying to repeatedly use their gun again and again, and you calculate in that routine from fire to load to fire again, how much of the time does the gun spend empty and how much does it spend loaded? The answer is it spends 90% of its time empty and 10% of its time loaded. So when you now look at the guns that were left on the battlefield, what do you find? You find that only about 20% of the muskets are in fact empty. You would have expected 90%. About 40% or so of them are loaded with a single cartridge. Another 25% or so are loaded with 2 cartridges. And the remainder are loaded with 3 or more cartridges. Some of them are loaded with up to 20 cartridges. Now, just in case you're not an expert on Civil War firearms, there is no reason to load one of these guns more than once. These are muzzle-loaded weapons. So you're just making that weapon dysfunctional. It's not that you've broken it. You could still fire it, but it just wouldn't work very well. So one of the best available interpretations of what was happening on the battlefield in Gettysburg is that soldiers on the front line, in a situation where their survival depended on them shooting people standing in front of them, were loading their weapons, pretending to shoot, loading their weapons again, pretending to shoot again, until finally somebody turned around and shot them. Okay? So that's a really, really striking fact to try to account for. And when I read it, I thought, we've got to find a way to take this phenomenon. What it implies is that humans have this deep, powerful aversion to doing harm to other humans, even in the circumstances where it's most necessary for their own survival to do it. We've got to try to get that phenomenon into the lab. So I'm going to describe a few studies where we try to do a little bit of psychology surrounding the aversion to harm, understanding it and also understanding how it contributes to our capacity to make moral judgments of other people. Then I'm going to talk about the stuff that many of us in the lab are finding so exciting today, which is a potential connection between that psychological research that we're engaged in and current models of the neuroscience of decision making. This is going to be a hypothesis. I don't expect you to come out of this talk convinced that this connection is a valid one, and I'll be really eager for your feedback on whether we might be on the right track or the wrong track and how far you can push this kind of model. And then finally, I'm just going to sketch a couple really limited thoughts about what this might mean for law broadly construed, law including policy But here, I'm going to try to just be as brief as I can possibly be because that's not an area where I'm an expert. It's an area where all of you are experts, and I'm going to be really eager to hear your thoughts. So starting with the psychology, again, there's a lot of hypotheses that we might have for this data. That is, hypotheses about why it is that the guns are being left loaded on the battlefield. And I just want to introduce you to the particular hypothesis that we were interested in pursuing further in the lab. We were struck by the idea that although everybody knows that there's a causal connection between shooting a gun and dead people, whereas you are willing to accept in the abstract that you might be responsible for killing the enemy, when it comes down to the moment where there is literally a loaded gun in your hand and your finger wraps around the trigger and you're required to perform the action of shooting that gun, there's something about the act itself, literally the physical action, which is difficult for you to perform, despite the fact that you're willing to accept the outcome, again, in the abstract that it would cause. So this is a hypothesis. It's not obviously true. But the hypothesis is that when people were resistant to shooting, in some interesting sense, it wasn't that they were resistant to the outcome that they were going to kill somebody, as much as they were resistant to the very physical act of pulling the trigger. Okay? And we're going to try to understand why that might be. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but you have to remember, we live in a universe where human beings, at the same time, are capable of performing an action in a very disconnected way that can kill tens of thousands of people at once, and yet in another context can't perform an action that would kill just one single individual. Right? This is a single individual who manages to stop the Chinese army by standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square. So there's something about I think there's something intuitively correct about the idea that there are certain kinds of physical actions that we find it very difficult to perform, and other types of physical actions that we find it easy to perform, even when the outcomes are obviously so much greater in terms of the loss of human lives, in this case, than in this one. Right? It's an interesting problem about the human brain. How can it be the same brain that is capable of doing this and finds itself incapable of doing that? So we wanted to design an experiment where we could isolate the aversion that people have to the physical act of shooting from the outcome that it causes a dead person. Right? That's interesting both because it's going to test our hypothesis about the underlying psychology. It's also helpful because, of course, if we want to study war in the lab, somehow we're going to have to remove the fact that shooting leads to dead people. We're going to have to get that out of the equation. So our first attempt to do this was a collaboration with Wendy Mendez. Wendy studies psychophysiology. That is, she uses physical changes in the body, like changes in heart rate, skin temperature, the skin conductance response, essentially how much you're sweating, to infer underlying psychological states, and especially people's emotions. And so in this study, what we did was to ask people to perform pretend harmful actions and then look at whether their body was showing indications that they were having an emotional response to being asked to do that. So for instance, in this study, the first thing that people were asked to do, they would come into the lab, and either I would be sitting there, or more often one of my graduate students was, and the person would have their leg out like this. It would look just like my leg looks right now, but in fact, it would be a PVC pipe under their pants, and their real leg would be tucked behind. And there would be a big X marked on the shin. And we would give participants a hammer, and we would say, what looks like Fiery's leg here is actually a PVC pipe. But what we want you to do is to take this hammer and to smash the X as if you were trying to break his leg. Okay? But understand, it's just a PVC pipe. You're not going to harm Fiery at all. Presumably, people believed us, because why on earth would we lie about that and give somebody a hammer? Okay? And then we had them do 4 more actions that had this same structure, where they were performing a physical act that they might be averse to, knowing that there would be no actual harmful outcome. So we had them use a rock to smash a rubber hand attached to a person. We had them use a very realistic-looking, weighty replica handgun to shoot somebody point blank in the head. We had them use a rubber knife to cut them across the throat. And then we had them take, again, a very realistic-looking rubber baby doll. This, not a baby doll like you would give your child to play with. It looked just like a baby. And ask them to hit it against the table as if they were trying to break its skull. So Many of you are clearly having the same reaction, even just thinking about this, that our participants had, which is that you'd find it extremely difficult to perform these actions, even though you know that you're not harming anybody at all. Do you have a question? Yes, they did. There were some people who asked to lift up the pant leg and see that it was a pipe. Obviously, nobody was confused about the fact that this was a fake baby or that this was a fake hand that they were hitting with a rock. So that was more of a concern for people in some cases than others. I want to emphasize a couple things about this study that are really important just from a human ethics standpoint. We did not insist that anyone perform these actions. It wasn't like the Milgram study where the experimenter is standing saying, you must go on. To the contrary, we told people, if you're uncomfortable with any of this, we don't need you to do it. And the second thing which is really important about this is that obviously people knew they weren't harming anybody at all. I mean, this is like being in Hamlet and you're playing with a stage knife, right? So nobody came out of this experiment thinking, oh my gosh, I hurt a person today. But again, what we found is that people showed a robust physiological response. Here what we're looking at is the increase in one of these physiological measures of aversion in the condition where they're asked to perform this harmful action. And then we're going to compare that to a couple of other conditions. Here's a condition where they're asked to perform pretend actions that are non-harmful. So for instance, we say, here's a piece of wood and a hammer. Pretend that you're hammering a nail into the piece of wood. And as you can see, there's significantly less of a response in that condition. We also have a condition where we said to people, have a seat right in front of you. Fiery's graduate student is going to shoot Fiery in the face with this pretend. So they're watching, they're witnessing one person do this thing to another person rather than actually performing that action themselves. And again, you see a significantly lower physiological response. So what do we take away from this study? There's evidence that people have some kind of an emotional aversion just to the physical properties of the action, even when we've taken off the table the idea that there's any potential outcome that's going to occur. Now, obviously, that's not the sum total of how people make decisions in these contexts. Suppose that we hadn't told them that it was a fake gun. Suppose they thought it was a real gun. Surely none of our participants would have pulled the trigger. And it's because they would have known that there would be an actual outcome, right? So the difference between there is an outcome and there isn't an outcome is, in some sense, maybe the much bigger difference. It's the difference between pulling the trigger and not. But what's interesting is that above and beyond your sort of dry intellectual knowledge, there's going to be harm or there isn't, there's also a kind of an emotional response that you can't suppress that's tied just to having that gun in your hands. We wanted to then run some studies where we were able to directly compare the power of those two processes, the one that's focused on the act and the one that's focused on the outcome. Now, again, and to do this, we're going to have to start using hypothetical scenarios rather than real human participants, especially if the consequence is death, right? So in this study, what we asked people to do was to imagine a situation in which a friend was asking them to assist in the friend's suicide. And then we gave them 24 different ways that the friend might ask them to perform this assisted suicide. Now, many of these were the typical things that you would imagine. In order to get a list of 24, because we needed a large sample size to do statistical generalization, we ended up with some that are very peculiar. And I just wanted to be upfront about that. So you see both some things that are a little less peculiar and some things that are a little more peculiar. So people are going through, and for one group of participants, we ask them, how upsetting would you find it to kill your friend in this particular way as compared to the other ways we've discussed? And our hypothesis is that answering this question, how upsetting would you find it to kill your friend John in this way, will depend both on thinking about the outcome. And the relevant outcome here, you might think, would be how much your friend John suffers. Of course, he's going to die in all 24 ways, but some of these ways would entail a lot of suffering on John's part, and others would entail less suffering. So if you're focused on the outcomes, you'd be thinking, how much is John going to suffer if I kill him in this way? People might also be guided in thinking about how upsetting they would find it by thinking about just, again, that physical action. Like, what is the act I'm being asked to perform, and does it kind of give me the heebie-jeebies? Do I get that physiological response if I imagine performing that action?
Quick clarification question. So So did you have a kind of a 4x4 with these 24 of high contact, high suffering, low contact, low suffering, high contact, low suffering,
We had, yes, we had something like that, but it wasn't quite as, rather than saying a priori, we think this one is going to be high suffering and low,
Yeah.
what we did was to actually just ask people, and that's the next step in the design. So we have 3 groups of participants. One group of participants is asked, how upsetting would it be to kill John in this way? Another group of participants is only asked, how much will John suffer? So now, this is the key answer to your question. For every item, we know how much an ordinary person thinks killing in that way would cause a person to suffer. And we can compute the correlation between these two judgments, right? So on this axis, we're seeing, would it upset you to kill a person in this way? On this axis, we're seeing how much does a person think John would suffer? And each one of these points is a method of killing. So for instance, it might be that, putting a gun to John's head, that would probably be a dot like this one. I don't know which dot it would be, but it would have a particular rating on how much people expect that a person would suffer, probably not very much, and how upsetting they would find it to be to kill a person in that way, potentially a lot. Okay, so here's the relationship between those variables. There's a relationship. It's not huge. It turned out not to be statistically significant in this study. If we were to run a study with 100 ways of killing instead of 20, maybe it would be statistically significant. But as you can see, it's not a particularly tight relationship. I'm going to answer your question in just a moment. Okay, now we have a third group of subjects. And this group of subjects is asked, imagine that you are an actor in a movie. And as part of the movie, you had to act out a scene in which you would facilitate a suicide using each of these methods. Just as an actor in the movie, how upsetting would you find it to act out that scene? So this was our attempt to measure how averse people would be just to the physical mechanics of the action, holding apart any expectation that it would cause a harmful outcome, cause a harm to a person. And then again, we can compute the correlation between people's measurements on this and their overall measurements of how upsetting they would find it to kill John. You might as well have been asking the same question twice. At a statistical level, these are essentially, all the points fall directly along a single line. Okay? So just to sum this up in plain English, at least in the context of this study, if we say you are actually killing your friend John, how upsetting would you find it? People's answers to that question are better predicted by the extent to which they would be creeped out doing it on a movie set than by the extent to which they think it will actually make their friend suffer. And that suggests a rather shockingly large contribution of this aversion to the physical nature of the act. I know there were a couple questions back there, and I want to get to those.
I'm wondering about the outcome. Is this could also be something else? For example, which means that the outcome could also be how much do John's parents and his family and friends suffer. The same with when you kill someone. It's not necessarily true about
Just about that.
and the person being dead, but what will follow afterwards, and maybe you yourself suffer from mental issues
Yeah.
afterwards.
That's a terrific point, and we're actually running those studies right now in the lab. But I think you raise a good point. One reason we might not have seen as high a correlation here as one would expect is that we're measuring one dimension of the relevant outcomes, John's suffering, but we're not measuring potentially all the relevant dimensions of John's suffering. Okay, now, in our lab, we study both people's behavior and also their moral judgments of other people's behavior. And so we were interested in recruiting a fourth group of people and saying, now it's not about you killing John. Imagine you heard about somebody else who killed John. And now you're making a moral judgment of that other person. And we wanted to see whether people's moral judgments of the other person would be better predicted by expectations about John's suffering, or instead better predicted by the aversion that a person themselves would feel to harming John in that way. And what we found in this case was a essentially equal contribution of both of these two measures. So when it's about how upset you would be to do it, we see a very strong and potentially unique contribution of your aversion to the act on the movie set. when it's about how morally wrong it is for somebody else, now suddenly the question of suffering is playing more of a role. And I should also mention that these are statistically independent. That is, they're about half of the data is explained by one of these, about half is explained by the other, and there's not much overlap between them.
Well, I just wondered about, do you have a scenario for why John wants to die? And was it the same for each one, even in plot?
Well, we weren't very explicit about that. We just said that, to be honest, I'm embarrassed. I can't remember whether we said that he was terminally ill or whether we just let it be open-ended. But I think the most important point is, at the very end of your question, you said, was it the same across everything? It was exactly the same. We sort of presented, here's the John situation, and then we said, okay, one by one, we're going to describe ways to die, and we want you to describe, to give us answers to these questions for each of those ways. So whatever baggage people might have brought in, it should be consistent across all those
I
items.
just think that the amount of suffering you cause would be more relevant if your friend is not suffering greatly at the moment.
That's a really
But if
good
he
point.
is suffering tremendously, that I don't know if I would care that much.
Yeah.
I would go more for finality or.
Yes, that's right. I also want to make the point, just with respect to these data, which are so surprising in how weak the relationship is, we have already stipulated that in every case, John will die. And now we're just bargaining over that last little bit of suffering before he dies. So if we were comparing a situation in which John remains alive to one in which John dies, then the outcome might indeed be playing a much more statistically significant role. So I think that's a helpful lens to bring to these data. The overall message that I'm trying to give you is not outcomes don't matter or people don't pay attention to outcomes, but rather just it's surprising the extent to which, in addition to all the reasoning about outcomes, people are also being guided by some kind of intrinsic value that they place on the act itself. Okay, and then because this is, I'm so embarrassed that all of my research is usually about murder and death, but I just want to point out that these concepts can be applied to much more friendly and positive circumstances. So in America, we give tips typically around 20% to waiters. Presumably the reason we do it isn't because we have some intrinsic love of waiters, but rather because we're complying with the social norm that we've been taught, right? I find at least that when I travel to Europe, where that social norm is much different, where tips might be more typically around 10%, or depending on the country, a little more or a little less than that, I can't help but tip 20%. It just feels wrong. And it's ridiculous. I know that the waiter, apart from knowing that I'm American and then but whatever, if I spoke perfect French and the waiter believed I was French, they would have no expectation of a 20% tip. But it just feels wrong for me not to do it. And you can see how it has that similar characteristic. We can take the reasons off the table, but people still are somehow assigning intrinsic moral value to the act itself. And in this case, an act which is, in some sense, much more abstract and less physical than the act of pulling the trigger on a gun. But still, we have this abstract concept of the act of tipping 20%, it's hard to let go of the idea that that has value. So that's what I wanted to, this is just a couple samples from some of the psychological work we've done. What I want to talk about next is this really beautiful family of work that other people have done, trying to understand the neuroscience of decision making. And we are starting to think that maybe some of the lessons of this literature can explain why it is that we assign intrinsic values to particular actions in morality. And it's not an accident that I've chosen this particular brain region and this particular equation to stand in for that neuroscience. So about over the last, 50 or 70 years, people in computer science have been trying to design intelligent machines. Machines that can take experience by interacting with the world or some game and translate it into adaptive behavior. For instance, a machine that can intelligently play chess or play backgammon. For a long time, there was very little progress. And then in the middle of the 1980s, the computer scientists came up with a new family of mathematical algorithms that perform this translation. And this is perhaps the most famous among them, an algorithm called Q-learning, which for obvious reasons got Q's all over it. In the middle of the 1990s, some neuroscientists who were puzzling over this behavior of dopaminergic neurons in the basal ganglia suddenly realized that they could understand what those neurons were doing if they assumed that the neurons were using the very same equations that had been a breakthrough for the computer scientists. And this precipitated one of the most productive eras of research in the neuroscience of decision making. For the last 20 years, there's just been breakthrough after breakthrough in understanding how people learn and decide, how people take experience in the world and translate it into adaptive behavior by applying this family of computational models. The kind of behavior that these models explain superbly is the kind of behavior you see at Las Vegas. If you imagine that people lived in a world where there were lots of slot machines that paid out at different rates with different probabilities, some of them punished you, some of them rewarded you, and then you wanted a mathematical approach to understanding which slot machines people would invest in and when, that's what this literature does. One of the really interesting and perhaps unanticipated consequences of this research is that we've realized that there isn't just one way that the brain is making these decisions. In fact, there's dozens, but at a broad level, you can group them into two major families, two major approaches. And the best way to explain these two approaches is actually to describe an old famous study that was done with rats. So here's how it works. You take a rat, you put it in a Skinner box where it can press a lever for food, and you teach it that behavior. Then you take it out of the box, and you give it free access to as much of its favorite food as it wants. The rat is going to eat that food until it's stuffed, until you can put whatever rat caviar is in front of it, and it won't touch it, because it doesn't want food at all. So now ask yourself, what should happen if we put the rat back in the box? The obvious thing to think is that the rat has learned that pushing a lever gets it food. So if you put it back in the box when it's full and not interested in food, it won't push the lever. And indeed, that's often the case. Often that's what you observe. But it turns out that if you overtrain the rat, if you give it too much experience pushing the lever, when you put it back in the box, it walks over to the lever and just starts pushing it again. The food comes out. It just lets the food sit on the floor of the cage. It shows no interest in the food whatsoever, but it's now getting its jollies just by sitting there and pushing the lever. You can also force the rat to perform one of these two different behaviors by ablating different parts of its brain. If you ablate a particular set of cortical regions, then you find it does the foolish thing of pushing the lever. If you ablate a set of subcortical regions, then you find it does the smart thing and doesn't push the lever. So what this experiment is illustrating is that rats, and indeed we've learned now humans too, have at least two ways that they make decisions. One of them is often called in the literature planning. This is about the simplest plan that a person can have, but plans can be much more complicated. A plan is a causal model. It says if you do X, Y, and Z, they combine together in a particular way to produce this outcome. So if you want the outcome, do those things, and if you don't want the outcome, don't do them. Planning is flexible, it's really productive, but when the model gets big, it becomes hard to have enough time or mental energy to exhaustively evaluate all of your options. The other way that we make decisions is by habit. So basically, over the course of experience, if things bring us reward, we just store a very sparse representation in the brain that says something like, lever pressing is good. And then the world can change. Now I'm full. Now, if I were planning, I would realize that lever pressing is bad. But I've got this representation stored in my head based on experience that just says lever pressing is good. And if you knock out the brain regions that enable planning, that means I'm going to go over and just start pressing the lever. Okay? I want to suggest to you that these two modes of thought, planning and habits, are interestingly connected to the two concepts that I was talking about earlier, thinking about outcomes versus thinking about actions. The essence of planning is that you have a particular outcome that you want to attain, and then you think about how to maximize that outcome. If you don't want food anymore, then the outcome is devalued, and you're not going to engage in the behavior. Whereas the essence of habitual action is that it assigns value directly and intrinsically to the action itself, such that if the world changes and the outcome that was once rewarding is no longer rewarding to you, nevertheless, you persist in the behavior because the act itself has become intrinsically rewarding. And as I alluded to, when you look back now at humans and you ask, can we find evidence for these same mechanisms? We do indeed. Sometimes people evaluate their behavior in my hypothetical slots world by doing the math and chunking through the models. Other times, they do something much simpler where they say, I have a certain expectation about how much slot A is going to pay off. If I'm getting a lot, I'll increase the expectation. If I'm getting a little, it'll go down. Over time, I'm doing the same for B. When I have to make a decision, I just check my gut intuitions. Which feels better, A or B, dependent on the amount of reward that I've received in the past. And then I kind of habitually select the action which currently has the most value assigned to it. So the brain region that I showed you earlier and the equation that I showed you earlier are the brain region and equation that are responsible for this particular type of learning, this habit learning. This was the major breakthrough in the computer science. And there's many brain regions that correspond to this mode of thought, but the one most famously and reliably associated with is a brain region right here called nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens. So yeah, I even forgot that I put it up there myself. So what would we want to do now as researchers? Well, the simplest way to think about it would be, what if we could take all of those soldiers on the battlefield, the ones who weren't willing to shoot, what if we thought that it was their nucleus accumbens that had assigned, in this case, intrinsic disvalue, intrinsic negative utility, to pulling the trigger of a gun, because ordinarily it brings about bad outcomes. And now suddenly they're in a weird context where this is the very act that you would want to perform, which in some intellectual, abstract sense they're committed to, but that part of their brain that assigned intrinsic disvalue to the action is telling them, no, 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 this is a really bad thing to do. If we had much more time to talk about it, we would talk about how actually you might have a slightly different, for this particular thing, it would be a slightly different brain region and so on and so forth. The bigger problem is that you can't put this in an fMRI scanner and see whether college undergraduates are averse to shooting people. War doesn't happen in hospitals. So what we did was to come up with a kind of slot machine version of morality. And this is work that Josiah Annunziato, who's actually right over here, has been pivotal in conducting. So we thought, what if some slots produced bad outcomes for humans and other slots produced good outcomes for humans? One way that we could do that, and indeed what we did do, was to take a charity that runs an orphanage in Uganda. And we said, you're going to be making some decisions that are going to modify the amount of money that we send to this charity in Uganda. And we were telling the truth. At the end of the experiment, we actually did send, maybe a couple $1,000s to this charity in Uganda. And the precise amount that we sent depended on people's choices in this experiment. So there are going to be some slots that are associated with bad outcomes and other slots that are associated with good outcomes. And then we compared this to choices that people were making for themselves, $5 won or lost for the undergraduate in this experiment. Basically, what we're asking here is, all of this productive work that's been done on how humans play the slots in Vegas, is morality, in some sense, slots with people, right? Are you going to see similar computational mechanisms and similar brain regions applying when you're making moral choices? This is a project that's still under analysis. And I think we've seen some contradictory evidence. There's some evidence that suggests yes. There's some evidence that suggests no. Under no circumstances is this one study going to answer the question. But I just want to show you a little bit of what we've been learning so far, the stuff that we feel like we're most confident in understanding. OK, so we're comparing outcomes to these children to outcomes for yourself. And again, our prediction should be that both for the children and for the self, as money is accrued for one slot and lost for the other, we should see a signal related to the increases and decreases in your value expectations in this brain region, nucleus accumbens. And this is what we find. As you can see, it's not the only brain region. But we do find in this very same part of the brain activation both for the self in green, activation for the child in red, and then some overlap in the brain regions that are involved, shown here in yellow for the child and for the self. What's interesting about this particular finding is that we later discovered that another research group had run an extremely similar experiment, and they found the exact same thing. They found activation right around here, but it was more in the middle for the child and more to the side for the self. And it's just a beautiful illustration of what always happens in science. The question is, different processes for child and self or the same process? And the answer is maybe both, right? You have the whole brain where these signals could show up, and they're showing up right next to each other and kind of overlapping, which makes you want to say, yeah, those look like pretty similar mechanisms. And yet we and another research group have found that they don't perfectly overlap, which suggests that maybe in some interesting way there's also some differences. So, and I apologize to show you this half-finished study with a kind of Goldilocks answer, but that's kind of where we are right now. What I want you to take away from it is more, what is the approach that a neuroscientist can take to try to even answer this question in the first place? Now, you all are smart people. I'm sure that there's a whole bunch of objections that have been coming up to the entire approach or the entire theory, and I just want to address a couple of them right off the bat. First of all, the neuroscience is about people learning from direct experience, like rats pushing the levers themselves. But the moral psychology was about college undergraduates who didn't want to shoot a gun. But college undergraduates have probably never shot a gun before. They've certainly not spent a long time gradually accumulating the habitual response of like shooting other people is bad because it causes them to die. Fortunately, I don't think that this is a terribly deep objection, because other labs have done beautiful work showing that the very same brain regions tend to learn in the very same, or at least very similar ways, whether you directly experience something yourself, merely witness one person doing it to another person, or indeed just learn through verbal instruction, if a person does X, then Y is likely to occur. I think a deeper and more powerful objection is that morality is just obviously much more complicated than a bunch of rats pushing levers. That, if any of you are familiar with the history of psychology, the program of trying to understand really sophisticated, complicated human behaviors in terms of stimulus-response habit learning, that program got tried in the 1950s and earlier by Watson and Skinner and so forth. And the upshot that you would read in any textbook today is that it was a massive failure. And am I just repeating history's mistakes by proposing that there's an interesting role for these same mechanisms in morality? And here again, I think the answer is basically a Goldilocks answer. There's a lot in morality that we're never going to understand through simple stimulus-response habit learning mechanisms. At the same time, I think that there's influences on morality that those mechanisms have, the ones I've been trying to explain. And we're also starting to learn that more and more of the complex and productive nature of human thought depends in interesting ways on these stimulus-response habits, that the behaviors that in some sense most transcend the stimulus-response habits are built out of component pieces, where some of the components themselves are the really simple habitual things. I know that's a very vague way of putting it. I'd be happy to discuss that more in Q&A. So that's the thought, the kind of hypothesis that I wanted to throw out there about how some of the psychology might relate to some of the neuroscience that I find most exciting and interesting. OK, I want to leave time for Q&A, so I'm really just going to rate, and again, this is not my area of expertise, and I'm not really going to talk that much about law per se, maybe more a little bit about policy, but I just want to throw some ideas out there. Now, of course, at this point, you should be like deeply, deeply skeptical. We've all seen the movie in which scientists who have ideas about stimulus-response learning in rats try to apply it to law and policy, and with disastrous results. So I hope I don't do anything that foolish. I just want to describe 3 ideas that have been kicking around in our brains in the labs and maybe get some feedback from you. These are ideas where I think there's some apparent connection, again, to law and policy. First idea, is moral failure valuable? So these habit learning mechanisms, they learn best through failure. And that's a really uncontroversial idea, for instance, in the field of education. Any teacher will tell you that in order for students to learn really well, they can't just have success, success, success. You have to push them to encounter problems that they don't have the solution to try out a failed approach, and then that failure actually catalyzes learning in a positive way. That's an intuitive idea in education. It's kind of a counterintuitive idea in morality, but I think a provocative one. Do you need children and adolescents, and maybe sometimes adults, to make simple, small failures in the moral domain so that they can experience the negative outcomes and go through the type of learning that's going to leave them on the other end, in some sense, stronger and have more deeply committed moral values? So that's one idea. Second idea, we've been really curious whether the fact of the matter about how people make moral decisions matches ordinary humans' expectations about how we make moral decisions. That is, I've been arguing that people make moral decisions by planning, but also sometimes by habit. If you were to look in the law, I think the law acknowledges both of these possibilities, but maybe puts much more emphasis on planning than it does on habit. Right? The basic concepts of criminal law, I think you had Stephen Morse, is that right? So Stephen Morse, if any of you were there for his talk, loves to talk about how law embodies the basic folk psychological categories that we use to interpret each other's actions. Those are mostly about planning, and they're not very much about habit. So I think it's an interesting question. Are ordinary people and the law missing something important about how humans make decisions? It's easy to see why we might. My colleague Dan Gilbert likes to use the metaphor of the light in a refrigerator. So a child could be forgiven for thinking that the light is always on in the refrigerator because whenever you open it, the light is on. Our behavior is determined by conscious, rational planning processes and also unconscious, automatic, habitual processes. But whenever we look inside of us, obviously the processes we see are only the conscious ones, not the ones which are precisely the unconscious ones. And so we have this sense that the light is always on in the refrigerator when maybe to some degree it's not. At the same time, though, I mean, we do have a folk concept of habit, and it does appear, at least I think in some places in the law. And I think there's some contexts where we actually prefer people who make the quick, automatic, habitual decision rather than engaging in the planning process. And we've seen this a lot as people compare the decision styles of Bush and Obama. There's some people who really like the idea that you would engage in a long, deliberative, effortful process when making an important moral decision. And there's other people who like the idea that you would just know. You would just know instantly what is right and what's wrong, because in some sense that a learning process would have pre-compiled the appropriate answer. Okay, the final idea is, again, one that I think has been kicking around this campus for some time, which is, as we learn more about how people make moral decisions, can that help us to create effective nudges or to alter the choice architecture that people are presented with in order to get them to make the decisions that we would like? And I think it's really interesting to put that to sort of juxtapose that with emerging technology. So one might think that emerging military technology would circumvent the habitual responses I've been talking about. Let me be more concrete. In Dave Grossman's data on the Civil War, he found the frontline GIs wouldn't shoot, but the artillery would. There was something about the action they were performing that didn't seem to engender this kind of aversion. And then today, we're building machines that remove us further and further from the type of action that we might have, in some sense, a wise or valuable intrinsic aversion to. At the same time, the very same technologies can bring us closer, right? In a funny way, there have been reports that there is more aversion among drone pilots to bombing than among traditional pilots because the drone pilots have a direct live video feed to the consequences of their action that the traditional pilots lack. And I think these same questions, I mean, they're not just questions for the military. Every one of us has technology in our pockets that in some ways creates distance between us and in other ways brings us closer to each other. And it's interesting to think about how those interact with the types of learning mechanisms that I've been talking about and in what ways might they be nudging us into different modes of thinking, the sort of planned versus the habitual. Okay, so that's what I have to say. Super curious to hear all of your thoughts, and thanks very much.
Dr. Cushman, thank you for an outstanding talk. I should have mentioned in the introduction that Dr. Cushman runs the Cushman Lab on Moral Psychology here at Harvard after a stint at Brown University. I have numerous questions for you, but in the few minutes that we have, I'm going to turn them over to the floor. For those of you who have 1 o'clock classes and need to leave, please don't feel morally or habitually inhibited. For those of you who are able to stay, we'd love to take a few questions.
With regard to, just briefly, with regard to the soldier on the Civil War at Gettysburg, you referred to someone turning around to shoot one of the soldiers who wasn't shooting. And if this made me wonder, do we know just how dangerous it was for a soldier on either side not to shoot? How great the likelihood that their failure to do what they were supposed to do would be observed by other soldiers and officers?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. The answer is I don't have the slightest idea. I would love to know. We can ask a different version of that question, which is how dangerous is it not to have the appropriate kind of learning processes intact in the everyday world? And there is a population, there is a couple populations which seem to have deficits in the types of learning processes that I'm talking about. One of them is psychopaths. So it looks like psychopaths have at least 2 deficits. One of them looks very, very specific to morality, and the other looks much more general. The one that's specific to morality is that they don't have a typical degree of empathy or caring for other people. The second deficit that psychopaths seem to have, which is more general, is that they seem to be under-responsive to punishments. They don't like the feeling of being punished, but the experience of being punished doesn't seem to change their behavior so much in the future. And then in some really recent and beautiful work by my colleague Josh Buchholz, he's also found that maybe they learn a little too much from rewards. So there's an imbalance, perhaps, between the degree to which they learn from punishments and rewards, and you can see how that might lead to improper moral behavior. So again, it's one of these sort of Goldilocks answers if we think about what is adaptive. Is it adaptive to have these habits, or is it not adaptive? What are the consequences? And the Goldilocks dimension of the answer is there's some indication that there's important mechanisms which are not the general purpose mechanisms you use in a casino. Empathy is special and specific to morality. And then there's other mechanisms that look much more general, like your general purpose ability to learn from punishment versus reward.
I have a bizarre connection. So I was a judge for 17 years, and during that time we had numbers of gang cases in our courts and gang shootings, and I couldn't decide whether or not the gang members were notoriously bad aims. Because in fact, I mean, they would literally talk about shooting at someone.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, it would be very interesting to try to study what's going on here. This was less really about killing than discharging a firearm and having whatever, I mean, when you think of it, this constituency is not having these kind of moral feelings, but I wonder whether that's what's going on. It was clearly not to be caught, because they were
Right.
doing bizarre things, but it was not to kill.
So that insight is all over the psychological literature, and you've captured it really beautifully with that case. So a few things that it calls to mind. In Grossman's book on war, he talks about soldiers will write in their diaries or would say to each other that they would shoot into the ground, into the air, because there's a strong social desirability with all of your comrades there to shoot, right? But you can subtly do things that ensure that you're not actually going to kill a person. Second thought, in Milgram's experiments, he found that people would try to have their cake and eat it too in just this way. So if the experimenter, you know the classic experiment, Amanda might, for instance, be asked to administer electrical shocks to me, which appear to be extremely harmful, and you are standing over Amanda's shoulder saying, you must continue the experiment. If the experimenter demanded that Amanda continue, but then left the room, and just had a radio connection to Amanda, she would say, okay, here I am, I'm continuing, but she wouldn't actually push the button. So again, fulfilling that social desirability, not actually performing the behavior. The most direct connection, though, is to a study that was one of the important inspirations for our work with the pretend gun, a study by the psychologist Paul Rozin at Penn, where he actually had people play darts either with a bullseye or with a printout picture of a person's face. And he found that people suddenly had really terrible aim when it was a picture of a person's face instead of a bullseye. And his interpretation of that result was that even though they were professing that they were trying to hit the face, and even though there was no rational reason on earth that they would have been averse to hitting the face, you just have trouble bringing yourself to do it. Yeah,
Do you have time for one more question?
absolutely.
I saw we had one from the audience, so. Okay, thank you. Well, I appreciate it. So your two examples here, killing versus tipping, are fascinating to me in many ways, but the first way is that killing is often spoken of as a universal, innate, evolved moral prohibition. Whereas tipping, as you illustrated, is a purely customary one because tipping norms vary all over the world. And I once got in trouble in a bar in England by insisting on tipping the bartender, who was very ticked off at me. Are you suggesting that there is more similarity between these two types of moral behavior, what we think of as innate and what we think of as custom, than might conventionally be understood? And second question, in thinking of the Civil War, I can't help but think about ways in which it is different from a lot of other conflicts, Americans versus Americans, brothers versus brothers. How does this work hold up in issues where hatred or other significant incentives are at play, when it's out-group killing? And does that relate to any of the evolutionary biology arguments about chimps and out-group violence?
Yeah, great. Two terrific questions. So to the first question, yes, I am suggesting a greater contribution of learned processes than I think. I'll give you an example. So in Josh Green's original work on the trolley problem, when he saw an emotional aversion to killing, he linked that to the chimp literature, and he conjectured that it was likely a fully innate response. I think that some of the anecdotal evidence from war and some of the laboratory evidence that we've collected suggests that although that's likely part of the story, it can't be all of it. So for instance, it's hard to account for the difference between a rifle and a cannon on that theory. You might say neither of these was present in our evolutionary history, so we wouldn't have an aversion to either of them. Or you might say both of them are linked to killing, so if we have an evolved aversion to killing, we should be averse to both of these things. But the difference between them is hard to reconcile. And in our own studies in the lab, we do find, not with cannons and guns, but we find that the degree to which we make the method of killing more typical versus less typical seems to modulate the amount of the physiological response that we observe.
Typical or impersonal?
I
mean, a nuclear bomb is not typical, but it's highly impersonal.
Yes. Well, I would argue that a nuclear bomb I guess what we think we're manipulating is whether it's likely that people would have experienced through some kind of vicarious learning process
I see what you mean.
a connection between this act and bad consequences.
Yeah.
But I don't want to make the argument that evidence for learning is evidence against something innate.
Sure.
And moreover, to return to this question about psychopathy, what evolution might have given us is a innate caring about other people. And then what learning does is to connect that innate caring about people to particular physical actions. And at that level, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. There's an evolutionary story according to which killing is a special thing that we're evolved to avoid. But evolution couldn't anticipate every method that a person could use to kill. We have learning mechanisms that can associate novel methods with that core aversion to harm, if that helps. And then the second, quickly remind me, the second question.
Hatred.
Hatred and outgroup members, and are there contexts in which you lack the aversion to harm?
Exactly.
Everything that I'm aware of in the psychological literature and common sense dictate yes. We haven't combined these concepts about habit learning with the in-group, out-group dimension until this semester. There's a project ongoing in which we have people engaging in harmful actions towards in-group or out-group members. We haven't even looked at the data yet because there's too little of it. I'm sure all of us share the same depressing hypothesis, but stay tuned.
Fabulous. Do you have time for, are you willing to stay?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
There was one last question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this kind of ties off of that. I was just curious your opinion on whether and the extent to which this sort of research should inform our thinking about the rightness or wrongness of certain sorts of moral judgments. So it seemed like with the Civil War and the drone, you were on the side that what's innate is, you know, we're beautiful creatures or something, and that's right. But then I'm sure for many people in the room, the Bush versus Obama is more actually the System 2 calculated drone version is maybe a better way to make decisions. And I know there's some debate in the philosophy literature, but I was curious your opinion on, you know, whether pointing out these mechanisms and showing that it's habit tells us that these sorts of moral judgments are correct or more legitimate or less, or is just irrelevant for that debate.
You know, I've occasionally convinced myself that it is relevant to that debate, and then I remember that the last time I convinced myself it was the opposite conclusion. And it comes down exactly to what you're saying. I think I come into the research with priors in any individual context about what the morally correct answer must be. And in contexts where this time it happens to be the habitual response, I think, aha, habits, you know, this is a reasonable mechanism, or aha, it's innate, you know, evolution is wise. And then in other circumstances, when it happens to contradict my prior moral conviction, I say to myself, oh yeah, you know, evolution programs heuristics, and then those heuristics don't apply in the modern world, and so we're making foolish choices. So I haven't personally found that it is super productive to just take a general purpose argument and apply it. You know, habit is always right, habit is always wrong, so on and so forth. What I do think can be very valuable is to use the science to ask whether the moral intuition that we have is produced by the considerations that we might have guessed upon reflection or not. So if, say, we're in a debate over physician-assisted suicide, and I am convinced that it's inappropriate, and the particular case that I have in mind happens to be one that I would be very averse to performing. So my data suggests there's a reason why I'm very averse to performing that action, and that reason might be tied to some personal or vicarious learning process that makes that particular action one of the ones I assign a lot of negative value to. And then I read a paper on psychology or neuroscience, and I say, oh, I thought the reason that I was averse to it was because a person dies or a person suffers. But the science tells me that maybe part of the reason that I'm averse to it is because there's a particular learning process that's connected with the physical nature of the action that I'm performing. I think that's useful information. In and of itself, it's not going to settle the debate, but it would debunk or erode my confidence in a particular source of evidence. I would have uncritically assumed that my own intuition was connected to a reason I would endorse, and then I would discover that my intuition was in fact connected to a reason that I might not endorse on reflection. And then I can say, okay, well maybe I need to be imagining a different case of physician-assisted suicide, one where the action isn't one where there's a relevant or whatever it is. But it can, I think it in the same way that if you're looking for water in the desert and you realize that what appears to be water actually has a psychological cause which is not linked to water itself, but rather linked to heat dissipating off of the sand, that's going to influence your decision making, and rightly so.
That's a wonderful place to end on the idea of moral mirage, and how much of our moral thinking may have this illusory quality. What a fascinating talk, Dr. Cushman. This also raises issues around social and religious taboo, and how taboo can come to feel as powerful as something like a prohibition, a core moral prohibition against causing harm, and that this may account for some of the intractable nature and inability to understand and come to common ground on some of our most divisive social issues that have a social learning and habit learning component, but feel as morally profound as something like the prohibition against killing. This can help us understand not only aspects and features of our legal decision making, but of persistent and recurrent problems in our political discourse. With that, just want to thank you again. Really terrific talk.